Most backyard gardeners are taught to solve every problem one product at a time. If the soil looks weak, you buy fertilizer. If the vines need support, you build a trellis. If the ground dries out, you water more often. And if weeds keep coming back, you mulch, pull, spray, and repeat. It feels normal because that is the model most people inherit. But over time, that model turns a simple garden into a list of chores that never really ends. The hidden cost is not just money, it is dependence. You begin to believe that healthy growth has to be imported from a bag, a bottle, or a store shelf. You start thinking the garden cannot function unless you constantly step in and rescue it. And that is where a lot of people quietly lose heart. Not because they are lazy, not because they do not care, but because they were handed a system that makes growing food feel harder than it should. I have seen it happen again and again in small backyards. A person starts with good intentions. They plant one crop here, another crop there, and try to manage each one like a separate job. The corn needs feeding, the beans need support, the squash needs room, the soil needs help, the weeds keep returning. Before long, what was supposed to feel grounding starts to feel expensive and exhausting. The garden grows, but so does the maintenance. What is easy to miss is that this struggle often has very little to do with effort. It has everything to do with design. If the system is wrong, even a hardworking gardener stays busy solving problems that should never have appeared in the first place. You can pour more money into that kind of garden every season and still feel like you are always behind. There is an older way to think about it, a quieter way, one that does not begin with products at all. It begins with relationships. A proven planting method used long before modern garden centers existed was built on a very simple idea. Instead of asking how to feed each crop separately, it asked how one plant could help another. Instead of forcing the gardener to provide every solution, it arranged the plants so the system could do more of the work on its own. That old method solved three of the biggest backyard problems at once: fertility, support, ground cover, and it did it with three common crops that most people would never think to treat as a single unit. No separate trellis, no heavy fertilizer program, no constant battle to keep the soil exposed and struggling under the sun. Just a low-cost planting system that worked because each part carried part of the load. That is the part most people were never shown. You do not always need more inputs. Sometimes you need a better arrangement. Sometimes the answer is not adding more to the garden, but planting in a way that lets the garden hold itself together. And once you see that, you start looking at the backyard differently, not as a space full of isolated plants, but as a living system that can be designed to share work, conserve moisture, and build strength over time. There is a reason this method lasted for centuries. It was not a trend. It was not a shortcut. It was a practical solution built by people who could not afford waste and who understood that a family garden had to be reliable. When a method survives that long, across generations, it usually means it solves something real. In this case, it solved more than people realize. It reduced the need for outside fertilizer. It cut down on extra materials. It protected the soil instead of exposing it. And it gave ordinary growers a way to produce food from a small space using cooperation instead of constant correction. Once you understand how it works, a lot of modern gardening advice starts to look strangely incomplete. So before you buy another bag, build another frame, or assume your soil needs more help from outside, it is worth looking at one old system that approached the whole problem differently. Because sometimes the cheapest method is not the weakest one. Sometimes it is the one that has already been tested for 1,000 years and quietly kept working while the rest of the world moved on. Most people are not failing because they are doing too little. They are failing because they were shown a model that separates everything that should be working together. You were taught to treat each plant as an individual problem, feed this one, support that one, protect another. It sounds logical at first, but it slowly pulls the garden apart into pieces that depend entirely on you to stay alive. That approach did not come from the backyard. It came from large-scale farming, where uniform rows and single crops are easier to manage with machines. In that world, separation makes sense. But when that same thinking is brought into a small garden, it creates more work than it solves. You end up trying to replace natural relationships with purchased inputs. So if your soil feels tired after a season, or your plants seem to struggle without constant attention, it is not because you did something wrong. It is because the system you were given expects you to do everything the ecosystem would normally do on its own. And that is a heavy role to carry in a small space. In nature, you almost never find a single plant growing alone in perfect rows. You find layers. You find support. You find cover. One plant reaches upward, another spreads low, another works quietly underground. Each one fills a gap the others leave behind. That is what keeps the soil stable, the moisture balanced, and the nutrients cycling without interruption. When you start looking at your backyard through that lens, something shifts. Instead of asking, "What does this plant need from me?" you begin to ask, "What does this plant offer to the system?" That one change removes a lot of pressure. It turns the garden from a list of demands into a network of contributions. I learned this slowly, not from a book, but from watching what happened when I stopped trying to manage everything separately. The more I grouped plants with purpose, the less I had to intervene. The soil stayed cooler, the moisture lasted longer. Growth felt steadier, not perfect, but more balanced. And that balance is what most people are actually looking for, even if they do not call it that. This is where the idea of planting as a system begins to make sense. A system is not just a collection of parts. It is a structure where each part supports another. If one piece improves the soil, another can use it. If one creates shade, another can benefit from it. The work is shared. The results are more stable. The older method I mentioned earlier follows that exact principle. It does not rely on controlling every variable. It relies on arranging the right plants so they cover each other's weaknesses. Over time, that creates a kind of quiet resilience. The garden does not collapse the moment you step away for a few days. It holds together. This is also where cost begins to drop. When plants start doing part of the work, you stop needing to supply everything yourself. Fewer inputs, fewer corrections, fewer emergencies. Not because you are ignoring the garden, but because the system is carrying more of the load. It is a different kind of confidence. Not the kind that comes from having the right products on hand, but the kind that comes from knowing the structure is sound. That even if conditions are not perfect, the system will keep moving in the right direction. Once you understand that, the question changes again. It is no longer about how to grow each plant better. It becomes about how to place them together so they solve problems before those problems begin. And that is where the old method starts to reveal its value, not as a trick, but as a design that quietly replaces effort with cooperation. Long before fertilizers were packaged and sold, before trellises were stacked in garden centers, and before anyone thought to separate crops into neat individual rows, there were people growing food in a very different way. Not by controlling the land, but by working with it. In the northeastern regions of North America, the Iroquois people developed a planting method that did not rely on tools or products. It relied on observation, on patience, and on a deep understanding of how plants behave when they are allowed to support each other instead of compete. They passed this knowledge down without books, no diagrams, no written instructions. It moved from one generation to the next through memory and practice. Families would prepare small mounds of soil, often arranged in simple patterns, and plant 3 crops together in the same space. Not randomly, not for convenience, but with intention. Corn was planted first, not in isolation, but as a foundation. It was given time to grow strong and upright, forming a vertical structure in the center of each mound. This was important. The system depended on it. Without that structure, the rest would not hold together. A short time later, beans were added around the base. At first glance, it might seem like they would compete, but they did something very different. As they grew, they reached upward, gently wrapping around the corn. No ties, no supports, just a natural response to what was already there. The corn did not resist. It simply carried the beans as it continued to grow. Then came the squash, planted last, spreading outward from the same mound. Its leaves widened and settled across the surface of the soil, filling the empty space that would otherwise be exposed. Within a few weeks, the ground beneath began to disappear under a layer of living cover. What formed was not 3 separate crops. It was a single structure with 3 roles. each plant doing something specific, each one placed at the right time, in the right position, to make the whole system stable. The Iroquois called them the Three Sisters, not as a metaphor, but as a description of function. Each one depended on the others. Remove one, and the balance changed. Keep them together and the system held. There is something quiet about the way this method works. It does not announce itself. It does not look complicated. In fact, most people might walk past it without noticing anything unusual. Just corn, beans, and squash growing in the same place. But if you stop and observe, the structure becomes clear. The height, the support, the cover, the layering of roles that most modern gardens try to build artificially, piece by piece, with added materials and inputs. Here it was already solved, not with more effort, but with better placement. And that is the part that tends to stay hidden. Because when you first hear about it, it sounds almost too simple. Three common plants, no special tools, no added complexity, just timing, spacing, and a basic understanding of how each one behaves. It does not feel like a breakthrough. It feels like something obvious. But sometimes the most stable systems are the ones that do not draw attention to themselves. They work quietly, season after season, without needing to be adjusted or corrected every few days. That is what allowed this method to last. Not because it was impressive, but because it was reliable. It fit into daily life. It did not demand constant attention, and it produced food in a way that families could depend on. If you step back for a moment, you start to see the difference between this and the model most people follow today. One builds a garden that needs to be managed. The other builds a garden that manages itself, at least in part. And once that difference becomes clear, the next question naturally follows. How exactly do these three plants support each other in a way that replaces so many separate tasks? That is where the system begins to reveal its deeper structure. If you start at the surface, the Three Sisters system looks simple, but the real work begins underground, in a place most people never think to look. That is where the first part of the system quietly does its job, without drawing attention. The beans are not just there to grow food, they are there to change the soil itself. Most gardeners are taught that plants take nutrients from the ground, and once those nutrients are gone, they have to be replaced. That is why fertilizers become part of the routine. You plant, the soil loses strength, and then you add something back in. Season after season, that cycle repeats. But beans do something different. Along their roots, small nodules begin to form. You usually do not notice them unless you pull the plant up and look closely. Inside those nodules lives a type of bacteria that works in partnership with the plant. Not as a disease, not as a problem, but as a quiet exchange. The plant feeds the bacteria with sugars, and in return, the bacteria take nitrogen from the air and convert it into a form the plant can use. That one process changes the entire equation, because nitrogen is one of the main elements plants need to grow. It is the reason fertilizers are often labeled with high nitrogen content. It is what drives green growth, strong stems, and healthy leaves. And in most gardens, it is something people feel they have to buy. But here it is being produced right in the soil, not added from the outside, not spread across the surface, but created slowly, directly where the roots can reach it. And not just for the beans themselves. Some of that nitrogen becomes available to the surrounding plants, especially when roots interact and when organic matter begins to break down over time. It does not happen all at once. In the first few weeks, you might not notice much. The system is still establishing itself. The bacteria are settling in. The roots are expanding. But as the season continues, the soil begins to change. It becomes more active, more balanced, less dependent on outside input. This is where many people misunderstand what they are seeing. They expect a fast response, like a chemical fertilizer that pushes growth quickly. But this is slower, steadier. It builds rather than forces. And because of that, it tends to last longer. Not just for one season, but gradually improving the soil for what comes next. In practical terms, this means you are not feeding the plant directly. You are supporting a process that feeds the plant continuously. And once that process is in place, the need for external fertilizer begins to drop. Not completely at first, especially if the soil has been depleted for years, but noticeably. enough to change how you think about what the garden actually needs. There is also a cost side to this. A typical bag of nitrogen fertilizer can cost anywhere from $20 to $40 for a season, depending on how much you use. And that cost repeats every year because the system depends on it. A packet of bean seeds, on the other hand, is usually just a few dollars, sometimes less. And once you have them, you can save seeds for the next season. The input becomes smaller. The return becomes more stable. But more important than the savings is the shift in responsibility. You are no longer trying to supply everything from outside. You are allowing part of the system to regenerate itself from within. That changes how the garden feels. It becomes less fragile, less reactive, more capable of holding its own over time. This is the first layer of the Three Sisters system. Not visible at a glance, not dramatic, but foundational. Because once the soil begins to support itself, everything above it has a better chance to grow without constant correction. And that is where the next part of the system comes in. Not underground this time, but rising up through the center, quietly carrying more weight than it appears to. Once the soil begins to support itself, your attention naturally shifts upward. Because the next challenge most gardeners face is structure. Vines need something to climb. Without it, they sprawl, tangle, or simply fail to reach their full growth. And the usual response is to build something. Stakes, poles, wireframes. It works, but it adds another layer of effort, another set of materials, another task to maintain. In the Three Sisters system, that problem is solved before it appears. The corn is not just there for harvest. It is placed at the center because it becomes the structure everything else depends on. As it grows, it forms a strong, upright stem that holds its position through wind and weather. Not perfectly rigid, but stable enough to carry additional weight without collapsing. This is why timing matters. The corn is planted first and given space to establish itself. It needs a short head start. Not weeks and weeks, just enough time to rise and strengthen before the beans begin their climb. If everything is planted at once, the structure is not ready. But when the timing is right, the system begins to align. When the beans are introduced, they do what they are designed to do. They reach upward, they search for support, and instead of being forced onto a separate trellis, they find the corn. They wrap around it naturally, following the shape of the stalk as it continues to grow. There is no tying, no guiding, no adjustment. It happens on its own. From a distance, it looks simple, just beans climbing corn. But what you are actually seeing is a shared use of space. The corn grows vertically, reaching for light. The beans follow that path, using the same vertical space without competing for it. Two crops, one structure, no extra materials. This is where a lot of unnecessary work disappears. In a typical setup, you might spend time building supports, checking stability, fixing loose ties, adjusting as the plants grow. And every season, you repeat that process. Here, that entire layer is removed. The structure is grown, not built. There is also a subtle benefit that becomes more noticeable over time. Because the beans climb the corn instead of spreading across the ground, the airflow around the plants improves. The leaves are lifted, the vines are organized, and the garden feels less crowded. That reduces some of the conditions that lead to disease, especially in small, dense spaces. At the same time, the corn benefits as well. It is not being drained or weakened by the beans. The relationship is balanced. The beans are light enough in their growth pattern that they do not overpower the stalk. And because the soil is already being supported by the nitrogen system below, the corn has what it needs to remain strong. This is what makes the structure reliable. Not perfect, not immune to weather, but resilient enough to function without constant intervention. And that is the goal. Not to eliminate all effort, but to remove the kind of effort that repeats without adding long-term value. If you look at the cost side again, the difference is clear. A basic trellis system, even a simple one, takes time and materials: wood, string, metal, or plastic. It might not seem like much at first, but it adds up across seasons. And it adds another task to your routine, something to build, repair, and eventually replace. Here, the structure renews itself every time you plant. Seeds replace materials. Growth replaces construction, and that changes the rhythm of the garden. You spend less time setting things up and more time observing how the system unfolds. It becomes less about holding everything together and more about letting the right pieces connect. By this point, two parts of the system are already working quietly. The soil is being supported from below. The structure is being formed above, which leaves one final gap that most gardens struggle to manage: the surface. The exposed ground that dries, cracks, and invites weeds the moment it is left uncovered. That is where the third part of the system settles in, not rising upward, not hidden underground, but spreading slowly across the surface, changing the conditions of the entire bed in a way that is hard to ignore once you see it. By the time the corn is standing and the beans have begun their climb, there is still one part of the garden left exposed: the surface, that open layer of soil that most people spend the entire season trying to manage. It dries out quickly under the sun. It cracks. It loses moisture faster than the roots can comfortably use it. And once that surface is exposed, weeds move in. Not because your garden is failing, but because nature does not leave soil uncovered for long. If you do not cover it, something else will. Most gardeners respond by adding mulch, straw, wood chips, cardboard. It helps, but it is still something you have to bring in, spread out, and maintain. Over time, it breaks down, shifts, or needs to be replaced. It works, but it is another input, another step. In the Three Sisters system, that layer is handled differently. The squash is planted last, and at first, it does not seem important. Small leaves, low to the ground, easy to overlook compared to the height of the corn or the movement of the beans. But as the days pass, it begins to spread. Slowly at first, then wider. Each leaf expands outward, reaching across the soil, and within a few weeks, the ground that was once exposed starts to disappear under a layer of living cover. Not placed by hand, not imported, grown exactly where it is needed. This is where the change becomes visible. The soil underneath stays cooler. You can feel it if you touch it. While the exposed areas outside the system warm up and dry out, the covered ground holds moisture longer, not perfectly, but noticeably. And that difference reduces how often you need to water. It also changes how weeds behave. Seeds that would normally sprout in open light now struggle to find space. The shade from the squash leaves blocks much of the sunlight that weeds depend on. And without that light, many of them simply do not establish. You still see some growth, but far less than in uncovered soil. This is not elimination, it is suppression. And suppression is often enough to reduce your workload without trying to control every small detail. There is another layer to this that is easy to miss. As the squash grows, it creates a kind of microclimate near the soil surface. The air stays slightly more humid, the temperature is more stable, and the soil life beneath has a better environment to continue its work. That includes the same processes that support the nitrogen cycle from earlier. Everything begins to connect. What you are seeing is not just coverage, it is protection. Protection from heat, from moisture loss, and from constant disturbance. And when the soil is protected, it does not need to be corrected as often. It holds its structure, it retains what it has. It becomes more consistent from one week to the next. This is usually the point in the season where the difference between systems becomes clear. If you compare two beds side by side, one planted in separate rows and one planted as a system, the contrast is quiet but obvious. One requires repeated attention to keep conditions stable. The other begins to stabilize itself. You water less, you weed less, you adjust less. Not because you are neglecting the garden, but because the surface is no longer exposed in the same way. It is being managed by the plants themselves. And again, the cost is minimal. A few squash seeds, often included in a single packet that costs very little, sometimes saved from a previous harvest. No need for bulk materials or repeated applications. Just a plant doing what it naturally does, placed in a position where that behavior becomes useful. By this stage, all three parts of the system are in place. The soil is being supported below. The structure is rising through the center. The surface is protected from above. And what begins to emerge is not three separate solutions, but a single connected system that quietly handles problems Most gardens try to solve one at a time. Once you see all three working together, it becomes much easier to understand why this method lasted as long as it did. Because it does not rely on constant correction, it relies on balance. When all three parts settle into place, something shifts that is hard to describe until you see it for yourself. The garden stops feeling like a collection of tasks and starts behaving more like a system that carries its own weight. At this point, the corn is standing tall and steady. The beans have found their path upward, wrapping gently without being forced, and the squash has spread across the ground, covering what used to be exposed soil. Nothing looks dramatic on its own, but together the structure is complete. This is where most people expect to still be managing problems, checking for weak growth, adjusting supports, adding nutrients, pulling weeds. But instead, the need to intervene begins to drop. Not to zero, but enough that you notice the difference. The garden is not asking for constant correction anymore. It is holding together. If you step back and compare it to a typical layout, the contrast becomes clear. Imagine one bed planted in separate rows, corn in one line, beans somewhere else, squash off to the side, each one growing on its own, each one needing something different from you. The soil between them exposed, the structure missing, the nutrients uneven. Now imagine the same space arranged as a system. The corn rising from the center, carrying the beans upward, the beans feeding the soil below, the squash sealing the surface. Every layer connected, every function shared. After a few weeks, the difference is not just visible, it is measurable. In studies that looked at this method, including research supported by agricultural institutions, the combined yield of protein from corn and beans grown together in this way was higher than when they were planted separately on the same amount of land. Not by a small margin, but enough to matter over a full season. That result is not coming from pushing the plants harder. It is coming from reducing the gaps between them. Less wasted space, less lost moisture, more efficient use of nutrients. The system is not forcing growth. It is supporting it in a way that stays consistent. There is also a kind of stability that develops over time. If you miss a day of watering, the covered soil holds on longer. If the weather shifts, the layered structure softens the impact. If one plant struggles slightly, the others continue to support the overall balance. It is not perfect, but it is less fragile. And that matters more than people think. Because most backyard gardens do not fail all at once. They decline slowly. A little stress here, a small imbalance there. Over time, those small issues add up, and the gardener ends up chasing them, trying to bring everything back into line. In a system like this, fewer of those issues appear in the first place. The soil stays active, the structure stays intact, the surface stays protected, and because of that, the garden moves forward with fewer interruptions. There is a moment, usually somewhere around the middle of the season, when you realize you are not doing as much as you expected. You are still present, still observing, but not constantly fixing. The system has taken over part of that role, quietly without drawing attention to itself. That is where the real value begins to show. Not just in yield, but in consistency, in the way the garden feels manageable, even on days when you do not have much time, in the sense that things are working together instead of pulling apart. And once you experience that, it becomes harder to go back to a layout where everything depends on you to stay in place, because you have seen what happens when the work is shared. Not evenly, not perfectly, but enough to change the way the garden behaves. And that is what this method was always designed to do. Not to maximize control, but to reduce the need for it. There is a part of this story that is easy to overlook if you only focus on how the system works. It is the part that explains why something this practical, this reliable, did not become the standard model most people learn today. Because the Three Sisters method was not hidden. When European settlers arrived in North America, they saw it. They observed how corn, beans, and squash were planted together. They wrote about it. They understood that it worked. In many cases, they even depended on that knowledge in the early years, when survival required adapting quickly to unfamiliar land. So the method was not lost in the beginning, it was known. But over time, the direction of agriculture changed. Not suddenly, and not because one system was completely right and the other completely wrong. It shifted toward scale, toward uniformity, toward methods that could be expanded across large areas and managed with tools and machines. Single crop planting made that easier. Rows became longer, fields became more uniform. Crops were separated so they could be planted, treated, and harvested in predictable ways. And as that model grew, it brought with it a different kind of dependency. Fertilizers to replace what the soil no longer regenerated. Chemicals to manage pests that spread more easily in uniform crops. Systems that worked but required continuous input to stay productive. Over time, that approach became the standard. Not because it was the only way to grow food, but because it fit the direction agriculture was moving toward. Efficiency at scale, control over variables, consistency across large areas. And in that process, smaller, more integrated systems like the Three Sisters were set aside. Not erased, but no longer central. For a backyard gardener, that history matters, because many of the methods people are taught today are adaptations of large-scale thinking. They assume separation. They assume input. They assume that each problem will be solved individually, often with something added from outside. But in a small space, those assumptions do not always hold. You are not managing acres of uniform crops. You are working with a limited area where relationships between plants matter more than large-scale efficiency. And in that context, older systems begin to make more sense again. This is not about rejecting modern agriculture. It has its place. It feeds large populations. It solves problems that did not exist in the same way 1,000 years ago. But it is also not the only model available, and it is not always the best fit for a backyard. The Three Sisters method comes from a different set of priorities: stability over expansion, balance over control, long-term reliability over short-term output. It was built for people who needed their land to keep producing without constant external support. People who could not afford to exhaust the soil and start over somewhere else. That perspective changes how you look at your own garden. Instead of asking how to increase output as quickly as possible, you begin to ask how to make the system last, how to reduce inputs over time, how to let the soil improve instead of decline, and how to build something that works not just this season, but the next one as well. There is also a human side to this that often goes unspoken. The knowledge behind this system was carried forward by people who paid attention, who observed what worked and what did not, season after season. It was refined through use, not theory, and it was shared directly from one person to another in a way that kept it practical. That kind of knowledge tends to be quiet. It does not come with instructions printed on a package. It does not change every year. It stays consistent because it is tied to how the natural system behaves, not to trends or products. And once you recognize that, it becomes easier to see why methods like this still matter. Not because they are old, but because they are still relevant in the right context. If you are working in a backyard, trying to grow food in a way that is manageable, affordable, and reliable, then it makes sense to look at systems that were designed with those same goals in mind. And that brings everything back to a simple question. If this method has worked for generations, with minimal cost and consistent results, what would it look like to try it in your own space, on your own scale, with your own soil? The answer does not require a complete change. It usually starts much smaller than people expect. You do not need to redesign your entire garden to try this. In fact, it works better when you start small. One bed, one section, a space you can observe without feeling like you are taking a risk. Choose an area that gets steady sunlight. It does not have to be perfect soil. This system is designed to improve conditions over time, not require them from the beginning. If the ground is compacted, loosen it a bit. If it is dry, give it an initial watering. You are not trying to fix everything, just preparing a place where the system can begin. Instead of planting in rows, form a small mound or a circular patch. It can be about 1 meter across, sometimes a little more. The shape matters less than the idea. You are creating a shared space, not separating crops into lines. Plant the corn first, a few seeds in the center. Give them space to rise without crowding each other. Then wait. Not long, just enough for the shoots to establish and reach a height where they can hold their position, usually a couple of weeks depending on the weather. Once the corn is standing with some strength, add the beans. Place them around the base, not too far out. They will find their way upward on their own. You do not need to guide them. Just make sure they are close enough to reach the corn as they grow. Then comes the squash. Plant it around the outer edge of the same space. Give it room to spread outward. It will take a little time to fill in, but once it does, you will start to see the ground disappear beneath the leaves. That is the entire setup. No additional structure, no separate feeding schedule, no extra materials, just timing and placement. In the early weeks, you still pay attention. Water when needed. Watch how the plants respond. This is where observation matters. Not constant adjustment, just awareness. You are learning how the system behaves in your specific conditions. By the first month, small changes begin to show. The corn strengthens, the beans begin their climb, the squash starts to widen, the soil holds moisture a bit longer than it did before. You may notice fewer weeds appearing in that area compared to other parts of the garden. By the second month, the structure becomes clearer. The plants are no longer separate. They are interacting. The space feels fuller, but not crowded. The work you expected to do starts to reduce. Less watering, less weeding, fewer corrections. This is also where expectations need to stay realistic. It will not be perfect. Some leaves may struggle. Growth may vary depending on your soil and climate. But the goal is not perfection, it is stability, a system that improves your baseline without demanding constant input. In terms of cost, it stays simple. A packet of corn seeds, a packet of beans, a packet of squash. Often under $5 in total, sometimes less if you already have seeds saved. Compared to the ongoing cost of fertilizers, supports, and treatments, it is a small starting point. And once you harvest, you have the option to save seeds for the next season. That is where the independence begins to grow. You are not just planting a crop, you are building a cycle, one that can repeat with fewer external inputs each year. The soil improves. The process becomes familiar. The results become more consistent. If you have more space later, you can expand. Add another mound. Try a slightly different spacing. Adjust based on what you observed. But there is no need to rush. One successful section teaches more than a full garden built all at once. Because what you are really learning is not just how to grow these 3 plants. You are learning how a system behaves when it is allowed to function as a whole. And once you see that clearly, it becomes easier to decide how much of your garden you want to shift in that direction. You do not have to change everything at once. That is usually where people get stuck. They see a method that makes sense, and they feel like they need to rebuild the entire garden to match it. But systems like this are not meant to replace everything overnight. They are meant to be tested, observed, and understood in a way that fits your space and your pace. So start with one bed, not the largest one, not the most important one, just a space where you can watch what happens without pressure. Plant the corn, give it time, add the beans, let them find their way. Set the squash around the edges and step back. Then observe. Notice how the soil feels under the leaves compared to the open ground nearby. Notice how often you feel the need to water that section. Notice how the structure holds together without extra support. These are small details, but they are where the understanding builds. You may not see dramatic changes in the first few weeks. That is normal. This is not a fast system, it is a steady one. It builds quietly, and the results show up in consistency more than in sudden growth. Over time, the soil improves. The plants interact more smoothly. The work becomes lighter, not because you are doing less, but because less needs to be done. There is also something else that begins to shift. Your role. You move from managing every detail to guiding the setup, from correcting problems to preventing them through design. And that changes how the garden feels day to day. It becomes less reactive, more stable, less dependent on outside inputs, more supported from within. That is where the real value is, not just in saving money, although that comes naturally, not just in reducing effort, although that becomes noticeable, but in building a system that you can rely on, one that does not need constant attention to stay productive. For many people, that leads to a kind of quiet confidence, You begin to trust the process, you understand what to expect, and you know that even if conditions are not perfect, the system will continue to function. That is a different kind of gardening, one that feels less like maintenance and more like partnership. If you choose to expand later, you can. Add another section, try a variation, adjust spacing or timing based on what you learned. But there is no need to rush. A single well-observed bed can teach you more than a full garden built too quickly. And if you decide this approach is not for you, that is fine as well. At least you will have seen how a system can work when the pieces are placed together with intention. That understanding stays with you, no matter how you choose to grow. So begin where it is simple. One bed, one season, one system. Watch how it behaves, and let the garden show you what it can do when it is allowed to support itself.